The title of today's lecture is The Firestorm of Dresden, War Crime or Warranted. And this is for graduate level history 580, the decisive battles of World War II. And we are, of course, in week 15 of the course when we're going to pick up our week 15 lecture about a third of the way through. As the incendiary bombs fell on Dresden, the phosphorus clung to the bodies of those below, turning them into human torches. The screaming of those who were being burned alive was added to the cries of those not yet hit. There was no need for flares to light the second wave of bombers to their target, as the whole city had become one gigantic torch. It must have been visible to the pilots from 100 miles away. Dresden had no defenses. No anti-aircraft guns, no searchlights, nothing. That was, of course, a first-hand account of the firebombing of Dresden, not by a Nazi soldier, but by a British soldier who was a POW at the time of the bombing. His name was Victor Gregg, and he concludes his account in his diary saying, "I insisted that the affair was a war crime at the highest level, a stain upon the name Englishman that only an apology made in full public view would suffice to obliterate." So is he right? Did the United States and Britain commit war crimes towards the end of World War II, war crimes that resulted in the gruesome deaths of 25,000 citizens, perhaps more? Today, we're going to look at the historical evidence and see if we can answer the war crimes charges of Sergeant Victor Gregg. So far today, we've been looking at what led to VE, or Victory in Europe Day. Now we're going to turn to one of the biggest and most controversial factors involved in the Allied victory in Europe, which is the bombing of Dresden. Next week, we're going to spend our entire class time together talking about what probably is the most controversial, the ethical issue of World War II, which is the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the last few weeks, we've heard of the casualties mounting as we discussed the Holocaust, the invasion of Normandy, D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge. And to understand why the bombing of Dresden is just so controversial, we're going to need to take a couple of steps back and consider the conflict in Europe as a whole and understand where we are precisely as a reminder in the World War II timeline. So let's go to the end of January 1945. The Battle of the Bulge, which was almost an Allied disaster, has been decided decisively in favor of the Allies, and that, it could be argued, was really the great last gasp of the German war machine. As a whole, the German army would be largely in retreat following their failed Ardennes and offensive. They would score no more significant victories. Early 1945 saw the big three Allied leaders, which of course is Franklin Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill, gather at Yalta for a big conference. As our textbook writer Anthony Baver notes in your reading, Roosevelt had just been elected to his record fourth term as president, but he would not live to see the end of the war. Churchill was trying to team up with Roosevelt in order to sort of stymie what Stalin was up to, but Roosevelt didn't cooperate, and Stalin himself, who was very paranoid about air travel, named the location of Yalta in the Crimea so he could travel there by train rather than plane. But this time, the Allies knew the war was drawing to a close, and this was not a war strategy meeting, but a post-war strategy meeting. And that understanding will going to be crucial when we discuss Dresden. Stalin looked at Yalta as a way to force the other Allied leaders to accept Soviet control of much of the Balkan and Central Europe. And in discussing the bombing of Dresden and its controversies, you need to understand why this is really important. In a lot of ways, Dresden was much more than the straw that broke the Nazis' back. I mean, there were several of those kind of straws, but Dresden was more of a brick. And by that, I mean, it was not the sole factor in the defeat of the Nazis, but it was a signally important one that almost certainly sped up the Nazi surrender, the suicide of Hitler, and caused a significant, horrifying blow to all of Germany in the Nazi war efforts. And Churchill was well aware of Stalin's plans to come in the wake of the end of the war and take over much of the land that was now occupied by Nazi Germany. But Roosevelt was far more lukewarm about opposing Stalin face to face. And ultimately, the results of this Yalta conference led to decades of Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. It led to the Cold War and arguably the situation we currently see in the Ukraine today. So, why did Franklin Roosevelt not do more to stop Stalin? The surprising answer to that really appears to be the fact that Roosevelt was in terrible health at the time. This was a fact that was hidden from much of the American public, but insiders knew. Historian Robert Dallek reports that Roosevelt had lost a ton of weight. He was very gaunt in appearance. He had far less energy than he normally had, and he was just 63 at the time. According to Baver, Roosevelt participated with his mouth hanging open, drool coming out at the Yalta conference, and he didn't appear to really understand what was going on, which is crazy. And if you really think about some parallels, it kind of raises a current political issue that we are going through right now in 2024. How old is too old to lead the United States of America as a president? And this isn't just an academic question. The world was brought to the brink of war, the Cold War, arguably because the US president lacked the fortitude at Yalta to block Soviet aggression. Joseph Stalin, emerged the clear winner at Yalta, even though he was several years younger than Roosevelt, which might just tell you that health and mental acuity is a bit more important of a marker than age itself. But that's not today's controversy. Today's controversy involves the bombing of Dresden, which occurred just 2 days after the conclusion of the Yalta Conference as a joint British and U.S., no Russian involvement, aerial bombing attack. And the timing of the attack and the participants have led many historians to conclude that the bombing of Dresden was a direct sequel and an answer to the Yalta Conference, even possibly a warning to the Soviets to not go any further than they did. On the night of February 13th, the first of four different raids hit the city of Dresden. Overall, almost 1,300 total bombers from the United States Army Air Force and the Royal Air Force of the Brits dropped 3,900 tons of bombs on the city of Dresden. That killed somewhere in the neighborhood of 25,000 people. Other estimates put it a little higher, and caused a firestorm in the city center that destroyed 1,600 acres. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris. He was the overall RAF Royal Air Force head at the time of the bombing of Dresden. He said this in response to it. He wrote to the Air Ministry and said, "In the past, we were justified in attacking German cities, but to do so was always repugnant, and now the Germans are beaten anyway. We can probably abstain from proceeding with these attacks. This is a doctrine to which I could never subscribe. Attacks on cities, like any other act of war, are intolerable unless they are strategically justified. But they are strategically justified insofar as they tend to shorten the war and preserve the lives of Allied soldiers. To my mind, we have absolutely no right to give them up unless it is certain that they will not have this effect. I do not personally regard the whole of the remaining cities of Germany as worth the bones of one British grenadier." That's an astounding statement. Whole cities of Germany not worth as much as one British soldier. Is he right? Well, Dresden had largely escaped prior attacks, and it had, at the time of the bombing, become home to over 300,000 refugees fleeing war from the rest of other parts of Germany. And Dresden was a historic city packed with museums, ancient treasures, and as we read earlier, very few defenses. And another firsthand primary source, diary, this from a man named Victor Klemperer. He was what the Nazis called a Mischling, or a mixed Jewish man in Dresden, who did not support the Nazis at all, and he identified as a Christian. He says this, and this is from his diary, written after the first bombing. He said, "We placed a candle on the table, drank a little cold coffee, ate a little bit, and groped our way over the broken glass in our house to go lay down in bed. It was after midnight, after the first bombing, and as my wife laid down, Ava said, 'There's glass in my bed.' I heard her stand up, clear away the glass, then I was already asleep. After a while, Ava said, 'Air raid warning,' and I didn't hear anything. It definitely wasn't loud. 'They're going around with hand sirens,' she said. 'There's no electricity.' We stood up. Frau Stuhler called at our door, 'Air raid warning.' Ava knocked at Frau Kohn's door, and we heard nothing more of either one of those. We hurried downstairs. The street was as bright as day and almost as empty. Fires were burning everywhere. The storm was blowing as before. As usual, there was a steel-helmeted sentry in front of the wall between the two Z houses. In passing, I asked him whether there had been a warning. 'Yes,' he said curtly. Ava was 2 steps ahead of me. We came to the entrance hall of house number 3. At that moment, a big explosion nearby. I knelt down and pressed myself against the wall, close to the courtyard door. When I finally looked up, Ava had disappeared. I thought she was in our cellar. It was quiet. I ran across the yard to our Jew's cellar. The door was wide open, and a group of people cowered, whimpering in the right side of the door. I knelt on the left, close to the window. I called out many times to Ava. No reply. So Dresden was not really a military city. Not exactly, though to be fair, it had participated in the war in a variety of ways, industrial communication, supplying soldiers, that sort of thing. But it wasn't precisely a military target. In fact, British Air Commodore Colin Grierson was the acting air commander in charge of the Dresden bombing. And 2 days after the bombing, he was interviewed at a press conference with journalists, and he gave 3 reasons for the bombing, adding one as sort of an afterthought. He said this: first of all, Dresden is the center to which the evacuees are being moved. They are centers of communication through which traffic is moving across the Russian front and from the Russian front to the east, and they are sufficiently close to the Russian front for the Russians to continue the successful prosecution of their battle on the other front. I think these 3 reasons probably cover the bombing. One of the journalists that was there at Grierson's briefing, he asked whether the principal aim of the bombing of Dresden would be to cause confusion among the refugees and evacuees, or was it to blast communications, blast the communications and stop the carrying of military supplies. And Grierson answered that the primary aim was both: disrupting communications and prevent the Nazis from moving around military supplies. But then he added something very interesting. He added an offhand remark that these sorts of bombings also help destroy, quote, what was left of German morale. So, a bombing campaign to destroy morale. Some people today might call that terrorism. And indeed, at that time, a United States Associated Press reporter 2 days later wrote about the Allied, quote, terror bombing campaign right after this. And 1 month later, Winston Churchill, the UK Prime Minister himself, sent a memo to the British Chiefs of Staff, and that said this: "It seems to me that the moment has come when the question of bombing of Germany's cities simply for the sake of increasing the terror, though under other pretexts, should be reviewed. Otherwise, we shall come into control of an utterly ruined land. The destruction of Dresden remains a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing." In other words, Churchill himself called bombings like the bombings of Dresden done for the sake of increasing terror. And his big concern was that there would hardly be any inhabitable land left over. According to the top brass, then, Dresden was a communication target, and attacks were meant to prevent the movement of military supplies, to destroy German morale, and to increase terror. These were, again, attacks on civilian targets. And that brings us to our big question of the day and your big assignment as students in the class. When facing a terrible evil, as the Allies were doing in World War II, how far is too far in opposing that evil? So here's your specific assignment for today. On a discussion board, answer the question: did the Allied bombing of Dresden constitute a moral affront? Or to put it in a much simpler way, was it evil? Or did such a campaign, though violent and destructive, serve a greater good? Your assignment is to post a reply of 400 words to the discussion board for the class on Canvas and reply to one of your classmates' posts engaging the substance of their arguments. I want you to use two direct quotes from your readings, but only quote a sentence or two, no block quotes. Oh, yes, one more thing. Victor Klemperer does indeed find his wife Ava, and they survive the Dresden bombing. And for those scholars in training who want to know more and dig deeper into the Dresden situation, I'm going to hand out to you a brief selected bibliography handout, which I will also post in today's discussion board.